Hey YouTubers, welcome back to Desert Have a Garden. In my last video, I made a cheesy sourdough bread, and that loaf turned out delicious and moist and had a wonderful flavor of cheese in it, but it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. So in that recipe, the cheese is shredded and incorporated completely into the dough, and so there is no discernible cheese actually in the bread. And what I'm looking for today is a satisfyingly cheesy bread that has little pockets of cheese in it. So I'm going to change that recipe just a little bit. We are going to start with the same basic bread recipe, and I will flash the ingredients on the screen for you if you want to pause it and take down a note there. And then we are going to change it at the second kneading. Instead of incorporating the shredded cheese into the dough, I am going to use chunks of cheese and place those strategically into the loaf as we fold it up and roll it for the second rising. So I hope you join me. If you already watched the other video, the first several steps are the same, and so you can skip those and go right to the second kneading of the bread. The first thing you need is the bread pan out of the bread machine, and you want to make sure that you install the paddle into the bread pan before adding any ingredients, because it is really disappointing when you have this full of all of your ingredients and realize you have nothing to mix it with and you have to dump everything out and start over again. So it's really important to make sure that paddle is in there, and we will get started with adding our dry ingredients first. So in goes our 4 cups of flour, next we will put in our salt, 2 teaspoons, you can even add more salt if you prefer a saltier loaf, but because this has cheese in it, it should be just about right. Then we will put in 1 tablespoon of sugar, and this is the coconut sugar. You can use regular sugar or another sweetener if you like. This just tames down the sourness of the bread. You can omit it altogether if you prefer a more sour loaf. If you do use honey, it adds moisture to the bread and it will make your loaf denser. Next are the wet ingredients, 1 cup of water. So this could be anywhere from 3/4 to 1 3/4 cups of water, depending on how dry it is where you are and depending on what types of flour you use. And then comes the star of the show, our starter. So you can see that this starter is happy, it's bubbly, it's full of life, and it is ready to be used. This was just fed yesterday morning, and so now after I use it, I will feed it the remainder and put it back in the fridge. And before using that, you give it a good mix up, and you see how sticky it is and stretchy. That is a good indicator of a healthy starter, and it has a nice, slightly sour scent to it. And this doesn't have to be exact. There's 1 cup. And 2 cups. Now we don't add our cheese just yet. We will add that after the first rise. Let's get it into our bread machine. You can see all the ingredients inside the bread pan. We place it in the machine and lock it into place. Give it a tug to make sure that it's locked in there. And we'll close the lid to prevent any splashing out. And the next thing is to set the machine. So I use menu number 8 for dough. and then you simply press start, and then it starts mixing. I will show you a peek of the inside as it just gets started here. And I'll check back with you in a minute as it is incorporating. As the dough begins to form a ball, it looks a little bit dry, but you have to give it a little bit more time. You want to make sure you allow it to fully incorporate before you start adjusting your recipe. It has been a couple more minutes of mixing, and you can see that the dough is starting to form into a nice ball now without adding any water. The machine has completed the cycle for the dough, and you can see that it is nice and spongy, well hydrated, but not too sticky. So while the machine is nice and warm, we'll allow this to close up and warm and rise. I allow it to rise for 2 hours. That doesn't have to be exactly precise. You can go as short as 1 hour, you can go as much as 3 hours, but the second rise will be longer, and you want a total rising time of at least 8 hours so that that sourdough can really process through the grains there. So I will check back with you in a couple hours. The bread has been rising for 2 hours now, and it looks nice and puffy. And so what I do is I stop the bread machine and then restart it on the same dough setting in order to allow the bread to knead up nicely into a ball. Once it is kneaded into a ball, then I will put it out onto the counter and begin shaping our 2 loaves. The machine has kneaded the dough into a nice ball, so I just simply stop the machine in its bread cycle and we will turn it out onto the counter. I take the bread pan out of the machine and lightly flour the surface I'm working on so that it doesn't stick, and also flour your hands for the same reason. Move the cheese out of the way there. Okay, and then out comes the bread, the dough, and you want to check for the paddle to make sure it didn't come off in the bread, and mine didn't. It's still in the pan. If you have a pastry cutter, you can use that to cut the dough in half. I do not, so I just do the ring and twist method. And then we have 2 balls of dough for 2 loaves. Now to begin shaping it, I flatten this out into a rectangle. This dough is very springy, very stretchy. That's a good sign, though it's not always the best for shaping it. Sometimes if you get too much flour, it doesn't stick at all, and then it's not good for shaping it. Clear that out a little bit. Okay, it's starting to somewhat resemble a rectangle. I was hoping to get my rectangle a little bigger, but it doesn't look like it's going to cooperate with me today. Let's try one more flip. There we go. Okay, so I want to roll this up with cheese in it in order to have nice little bits of cheese melted inside the dough. So what I've done here is I have sliced some cheese into small cubes. I get my cheese, I like to order raw cheddar cheese, and I get it in a 5-pound block. So I took 3 thick slices off of the block and cut them into small pieces here, and that's what I will be using to roll up into this loaf. So I'm just going to begin placing them randomly and rolling our dough. and securing it down by pinching it down and rolling and adding more cheese. And then just pinching it down to seal it in. And continuing on. So this is going to be very cheesy bread. That's the idea. Okay, so now there's a seam, and you press the seam closed. Kind of pinch it and press it. Okay, and then I want to put a topper on this, and so that it sticks better, I'll use a little bit of water and just put some water on the top. And I'm going to use this everything but the bagel seasoning with garlic, onion, sesame seeds, poppy seeds, and salt. So that looks really yummy. Okay. And the water helps that stick on there really nicely. Okay, and then I am using stoneware bread pans. And I'll lift the bread and set it right into the pan. And next I will make the next loaf, shape it. I'm going to get some of this seasoning out of the way so it's not incorporated all through the bread. Just a little bit of flour, see if that helps me stretch this loaf a little better. Now we have our 2 loaves here, and the next step is covering with plastic wrap. This helps prevent the dough from drying out. My air conditioner is running, so that's lifting the plastic, but I will move these out of the air-conditioned way. And next we allow it to rise for about 6 hours. Because it's sourdough, you want to allow a total of 8 hours of rising time, but you can allow this to rise even more if you like. I've allowed them to rise as much as 8 hours, but they won't be exploding high. They will just fill up the base of the pan and come near level with the pan when they're at a good amount of rising. The bread has been rising for 6 hours now, and I will remove the plastic wrap. You can see that it has filled out the bread pan with its rising. However, it didn't come up over the edge of the bread pan. Maybe just a little, but not very much. Next, I will score the bread in order to give it predetermined lines in order to rise upon and split so that it doesn't split down the sides. So using a knife, you can use a razor blade for this too. I'm going to do 2 diagonal cuts this way making sure that it punctures it very nicely, and then coming back the other way, forming an X. This is not necessary, but if you don't do it, likely your bread will split on the sides. And I will do the same thing on the other loaf. I'm using a bit of a sawing motion so that the dough doesn't stick. If you have a very sharp knife or very sharp razor blade, you should be able to do it without the sawing motion and just do a nice slice. Okay. Now my oven is preheated to 350 degrees and I will bake these loaves. It can take anywhere from 30 to 50 minutes. I believe mine usually take 35 minutes, so I will check at 35 and see how they look then. I checked the bread at 35 minutes and I didn't feel like it was quite done. When bread is done, it has this hollow sound that's really hard to recreate on a video. It's something that you just kind of get familiar with, but you always want to make sure the center of your dough is finished cooking, otherwise it can get really gross a day or two later if it's still like wet and gooey in the middle. So I allowed the bread to cook for 40 minutes and you can see these awesome squirts of cheese that like erupted out of these X's that I cut on here. And so I think that's really cool. It adds character to the bread. You allow these to cool down enough to be handled because stoneware retains its heat for quite some time, but also the bread will stick into the pan until it cools. But once it cools, it releases nicely, and that prevents having a ripped loaf. If you've ever been so eager to get into that warm bread that you just start tugging it and trying to use a knife to go around and pull it out, you'll end up with a torn loaf of bread. So these have cooled off quite a bit, and simply just turn them and lift them out. That one stuck just a little bit from the cheese right there. This is really pretty cool. I'm much more happy with the way this turned out. I like this. So look at all that cheese. No splitting on the side of the loaf. Our scoring worked out really nicely here, and I like the contrast between the topper and the dough that came out through the X there. Let's see this one. Same thing. I don't see that it split down the side at all. I would say that these are perfect looking loaves. The only thing left to do now is to actually try the bread. So I'm going to cut into these and give it a try. Let's give this a couple slices and see what it looks like. I don't feel like the video is doing this bread color justice. This time of day, I don't have the best lighting in my kitchen because it is evening. Oh wow, look at this. There it is. That's what I was looking for. Those cheesy little morsels inside the bread. Slice another one. Oh yes, look at that. So it looks like every slice is going to have a little bit of cheesy goodness on it. I'm going to put a little butter on a slice. This one here has a lot of cheese on it. I'm gonna go for it. There we go. All buttered up and ready to taste. All right, here we go. That is what I was looking for. Cheesy goodness, super moist bread, just the right amount of salt. The topper is the added bonus on here. This is definitely a bread you need to try. I hope you liked this video. If you did, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more updates in the future.